In this episode, we explore housing affordability and accessibility with Janneke Ratcliffe, Vice President of Housing Finance Policy at the Urban Institute. From the historical legacy of discriminatory policies to the current housing crisis, we unpack the multifaceted issues at play.
We have the same homeownership gap today that we had when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race when doing real estate transactions. And we really haven't been able to close that gap. And that's partly because, again, the successive ability of prior generations to help the next generation become home. It's all interconnected right now. And now we've got this crisis, and it really calls for a multifaceted response to do something about it. Because if we don't, it's just going to get worse. We have the power to set the rules that can make a difference here.
I'd like to welcome everybody today to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris with Land Gorilla. And today we are joined by Janneke Ratcliffe, Vice President of Housing Finance Policy at the Urban Institute. And her background spans the industry from nonprofit sector, academia, federal government, formerly at the CFPB. Amazing, probably one of the most amazing resumes. We were chatting offline, and one of the most amazing resumes that I've ever had the privilege of looking at. But her focus has been on increasing access to financial systems. Welcome, Janneke. Thank you for joining us today. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, specifically with your new role at the Urban Institute?
Sure. Good morning, Sean. Thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure. I've been working on housing finance policy and financial systems to improve opportunities for people in this country from the beginning of my career, whether it was running like a small nonprofit, really just 1.5 people, to working at a subsidiary of GE Capital in mortgage finance, to working for one of the country's largest community development financial institutions, which are nonprofit financial institutions, to working at a research center at the University of North Carolina, studying the learnings from those experiences and trying to teach other people about how these things could be done. A stint at the federal government, at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I feel like today at the Urban Institute, I have a great opportunity to sort of bring all these experiences and perspectives together in this work. So the Urban Institute is a organization that's over 50 years old. It's what we call a think tank. Which means we produce research. The Urban Institute's purview is mostly social systems, social policy in this country around things like taxation and employment and health policy, housing, those kinds of things. So that's what we do at the Urban Institute. We like to say we elevate the debate, which is to say we try to bring evidence and facts to people who are trying to make decisions about how to run policies and practices on all these topics.
Well, I absolutely love it. What are some of the key areas right now, or key conversations, big conversations you guys are having at the Urban Institute?
Well, great question. I think as I mentioned, we have a whole bunch of different topics that we focus on, and they're all certainly in an election year. A lot of these topics are being debated at the highest levels. We have some great tools. For example, you can look at some data we have on our charts. We have on our website 9 charts that show how wealth inequality looks in this country. Super fascinating tool that people like to refer to. A lot of work we're doing in tax policy and education policy. I manage the housing work at the Urban Institute. So, of course, housing is a big topic on people's minds these days. We have, a few years ago, we did some projections where we looked forward to 2040 about what would be the household formation trends and what would be the housing demand looking ahead, for the next couple of decades. And we really see some real risk that homeownership is not going to be as prevalent as it was, that homeownership rates will fall, that racial and ethnic homeownership gaps are projected to grow. There's also a lot of concern about the large aging population and what kind of housing they will be needed. So those are just some of the kinds of examples of ways we bring evidence to bear.
That's really neat, especially with the aging housing market and, some of the kind of that I would use the term theories, from my perspective. Yours sound a little bit more factual, but theories about what could happen, as people retire, as they die off. I hate to use that term, but what that looks like for the housing market. But, maybe to take a step back, how would you describe the current situation with the housing market?
So really, we have a problem that has been created by really created in a sense by the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis. So this all happened 15 years ago. It seems like a long time ago, but at that moment, in the middle of the foreclosure crisis, we really had a bit of an oversupply of housing. And then what happened is there was a big overcorrection. So people stopped building, financing for new construction got more constrained. And over the following 15, 16 years, we built new homes at a much slower pace than we had built for the many decades before. And I have a slide where we can look at that if you want to get into numbers and graphs, but you can also take my word for it. We've really been building lower supply of single family, of multifamily, of manufactured housing than we had in the many decades before that, especially on a population adjusted basis. So this has led us to a point of having fallen way behind in terms of new housing supply, and that has finally caught up with us big time during the pandemic when rates fell and everybody wanted to buy a house or people wanted to move, and there were new supply chain constraints that became a sort of a cyclical and additional cyclical barrier. Over the last many years, we've also had increases in land costs, increase in labor costs, ups and downs on materials costs. You probably know about this better than I do. As well as increasing regulations and land use rules, local land use rules that make it harder and harder to build enough housing. So all this sort of has come to a head, and here we are today with just not enough housing, and the end result of that is, of course, simple supply and demand curves. I studied econ in college, so I know how this works. Prices go up when there's not enough supply, and that's what the pinch that people are feeling today.
So it sounds like it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Like every kind of little place you look, it's this is going to impact housing, whether it's regulation or supply chain issues and interest rates. It's slowly kind of making it more difficult. Is that the best way to think about it?
I think that's true. What I think is something interesting to think about is it feels in a way that we just took our eye off the ball. Like housing is so fundamental to people's lives, to economic lives, to the economic and social lives of communities. They're important. Housing is important to employers. If you want people to come to work for you, they have to be able to, live in the community where they work. And so I just feel like we took our eye off the ball and let things just take their natural course. And unfortunately, that has led us to the crisis situation that we're in. And whether we're talking about people who can't afford to buy their first home, people who can't afford to maintain their rental properties or rent properties in the areas where they have jobs, all the way to increasing pressure on homelessness. It's affordable and there's not enough rental property. And there might be some empty houses sitting somewhere in Detroit, but that's not going to do people in California any good. So it really boils, you can look at these overall national numbers, but it's so important to understand your local market numbers as well. But what I would say, 10 years ago or so seemed to be a problem in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., where I live, has now become sort of a theme that you're hearing in communities all over the country. Mm-hmm. Mid-sized cities in North Carolina and rural areas near big, it's just all over the country. People are starting to hear pretty much the same sets of pressures. Even middle income renters are much more cost burdened than they were a decade or so ago. And again, harder and harder for young households and first-time home buyers to make that big step up into homeownership.
How bad? Or go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. You
I was gonna say, how bad do if we do nothing, right? If we don't change, and figure out solutions here, how bad can it get?
Well, this country is so the American dream, right, as we like to think about it, is so tied with housing and particularly with homeownership. If we don't do anything about it, we're going to see that sort of gradually, slowly but surely sort of slide off the table in terms of how we think about opportunity in this country. Housing and home ownership has been the primary way that families built wealth over the last 50, 100 years in this country. And to think that we won't have that avenue to do that. And the way home ownership allows you to build wealth is not just by you building equity in a home and slowly but surely, bit by bit, month by month, over 30 years, paying off your mortgage. It is also from the fact that when you become an owner with a fixed rate mortgage, you fix your monthly payment for as long as you decide to stay in that home and not refinance that loan. Where if you're a renter, your income continues to be eroded with increasing rents year after year after year. So you just don't have that same opportunity to put in that buffer zone to start building that wealth slowly but surely that you can then pass on to the next generation. So I do fear for that. I think it will be a very long-term evolution of this, where we just become much more a nation of renters, if you will, and then more subject to the whims of that market.
Yeah, it's really,
and that's for those who can afford the rental. Again, if we don't build any more rental property, you have to take into account that it may never be possible for somebody who bags your groceries, right? Or who cleans your house to be able to afford the kind of apartment in the community where they would like to live. And so there's always going to be a need, I think, for us to think about where are the opportunities to make it affordable for those folks to own homes, whether it's through direct subsidies to those households in a permanent level for vouchers and things like that, or whether it's just making sure the government commits to subsidizing the kind of housing that working families can afford to live in. If we don't do that, then I shudder to think.
And why is it important, right? I live in a high cost area, and we went on vacation this year to Idaho, and one of the ladies that we met there was, "Oh, you Californians keep moving to Idaho." And my earlier conversation this morning was with one of our managers that lives in Texas, and she's saying the same thing. Those Californians keep moving to Texas, but then you see areas like Detroit where, hey, there's houses that they're practically giving away to get people to relocate there to have more people. Why is the location of affordable housing important? Why shouldn't people move to, say, Detroit? And if home ownership is so important for them, why is it important that these high cost areas have affordable housing?
Well, the high cost areas are where the opportunities are, right? It's where the jobs are. It's where the employers are looking for employees. It's where we have amenities, educational opportunities, mass transportation systems. That's not to say these things don't exist in Detroit, but it's not an option for most people to just pack up and leave and move to Detroit and be able to live in a home there. And then there's family and community. I know that the United States sort of prides itself as, we could just pick up and leave and go west. But there is a lot of social value in the networks and communities we have. And to just imagine that people can rip away from that and just move to somewhere else where a home is affordable, I think that's putting the cart before the horse, or the house, as the case may be.
Completely agree. And I think it's important that people understand, the benefits, even though you may own your own home, why it's still important to talk about this, whether it's for your kids, whether it's for your employees or, friends or family. Affordability, really impacts everybody, regardless if you own your own home, right? What would you say are some of the misconceptions, about the housing market that you hear out there repeated? Like, hey, that's not quite right. What are the misconceptions that you constantly hear out there?
Oh, that's a great question. Do you have some that you hear about a lot?
The ones about affordability, not my problem, centered kind of around the NIMBYism, always get me. And, well, why it's as affordable? Is it important? Or do you have kids? I think that's always a good one. Or, land issues or cost of housing, what plays into, I'm a really critical over housing and regulation, and at what point, is too much regulation. I think we far surpassed, housing regulation a long time ago. And when regulation, you look at the National Association of Home Builder statistics, I think they're little over a quarter of the cost of a house. this related to regulation. I think in California it's like 37%,
building
a third,
regulation. A third of the cost of creating new housing is tied up to regulation driven.
That's a lot.
It is an enormous amount. It's completely unnecessary. And I know there have been increasing efforts to ease some of those burdens at the city, state, and even the federal government is getting involved. The federal government is trying to make grants to cities who pursue policies that lift some of the regulatory burdens and make permitting easier and faster. So that can be things around zoning, but it can also be things around a lot of the other requirements around permitting, everything, parking requirements and things like that, height restrictions and lots of different tools that can make not only faster, which lowers the cost, but also actually allows for more density and things like that, which can also create more housing at a lower, per unit cost.
I always love asking this question. I usually save it for the end, but if you were able to just snap your fingers, make one change, I'm the genie in the bottle. You get one wish here related to housing. What change would you make to make the biggest impact?
So we started at the very beginning talking about how the root cause of today's crisis is lack of enough housing units that people can afford to live in. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of thing that requires a massive response. And yes, a massive investment, but I think it's a really worthwhile investment in the future of this country. And if we have some time, I could cite some of the previous times the federal government has made these kind of massive investments. But that said, I would make a massive investment in subsidizing the cost of new construction for both starter affordable homes for sale, but also for rental in the moderate, low to moderate income range, mixed income rental housing.
And how would you? What do you think the most impactful way to do that is? Is it tax credits? Is it writing checks? Government buying the land and subdividing it themselves? Like, how do you see that?
Well, I think there could be, of course, sort of all things could be investigated. I do believe the beauty of doing it with tax credits is really more so that we just have a system for delivering those benefits, whether we just use the some new IRS program or whether we use established tools like the LIHTC the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It's an easier thing to implement than starting from scratch with a whole new program. So that might be the just to kind of get the. It takes a long time to build enough. It's going to take a long time to build enough housing to dig ourselves out of this hole. So we should start with the tools that are most close to our hand and start using those. So I think in that sense, a tax credit probably makes sense. I think it could appeal to builders and developers and be effective. But there could be other sources of increased funding through federal grant programs, subsidy programs. Whether directly or through towns and cities and states. Housing finance agencies could play a role, as well as state and local governments. Yeah.
You've put a lot of thought into this. I could tell, and I'm going to keep on this because my mind is going a million miles an hour of what the impact would be, if the government got really serious about this and did something. You mentioned there's been a couple times in the past where the government has done something like this, and briefly bring me up to speed on that because I don't know this.
Right. Well, okay. I'll try to be brief about it, but right, there was the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, we built the Federal Home Loan Bank System. We built the FHA. We built shortly thereafter Fannie Mae and ultimately added Freddie Mac. We just created a whole housing finance system. And there was a whole administration-led effort to sort of convert a lot of our production, which had been then came the war, and then after the war we had all these veterans. We were at least as many housing units shy, probably more so then than we are today. The veterans were coming home from war. Then there was a lot of administrative effort to repurpose our factory production back into residential construction, particularly. Definite initiatives to build starter homes that families could buy for the first time. Whole new subdivisions sprung up And as we've already talked about, unfortunately, a lot of this was restricted for white families, but nevertheless, millions of homes were built and the homeownership rate increased. Let's see, I had from 1945 to 1956, the homeownership rate went up almost more than 7 percentage points, which is huge. So this was just a huge concerted government effort to do that. Then there were other efforts later on, perhaps more often focused on rental family housing. In the late 60s, the government proclaimed the need to build 26 million housing units in 10 years. They didn't quite get there, but for the first 2 years that they were underway, they were building 1 million units. Yep.
Wait, 26 million. We're 5 million short by some estimates, right? Let's just say 5 million.
Oh yeah.
And 26 over how many years?
Build or rehabilitate 26 million housing units in 10 years. And while they didn't, the 10-year plan, politics happen, leadership changes, they did not carry the full 10-year plan out. But in the first several years, they really were able to generate close to 470,000 units a year. So we can do it. We've done it before. We've set out to do it before. We've been in deeper holes than the one we're in now.
And why aren't the markets responding? We need 5 million homes. Why aren't the markets just naturally responding, saying?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. We touched on some of it before. Mm-hmm. Regulation, land, all these things have made it pretty expensive. So if you could build a home, it really doesn't pencil if you're not building a higher end home that you can have a profit margin on. To build an affordable starter home or affordable rental property, it requires some subsidy. So that's, it's just not economic. There are costs associated with financing development of homes, and some of that is high cost, some of it's highly regulated, and lenders not being able to take the kind of risk to invest in that. So one of the problems is that what we are building today is not necessarily where we have the greatest needs. Mm-hmm. There's a mismatch there. So we've talked about some of the geographic mismatch, but there's also a mismatch in terms of more high-end construction when we actually need more housing for low and middle income families. We are seeing an increase I will say over the last few years, we've generally seen an increase in new home construction, although the pace of new home construction this year is a little bit below what it was on an annualized basis a year ago today. So I think we had some good momentum, but that is slowing a bit. And existing home sales are on a pace of about 3.9 million units a year, which is so far below the 6 million units that we were selling annually during the pandemic. So we're really, I think we made some good strides. There was a healthy increase in production of multifamily housing, although that's starting to slow again as well. But again, a lot of that multifamily was built for the upper end and more luxury housing.
And I would, I'll stick my neck out and kind of make this statement because I feel pretty strongly and confident about it. But I think a lot of that, that pace was just the slowdowns due to interest rates. Mm-hmm. Right? They had the momentum, but then, demand started to dwindle because people couldn't afford a higher interest rate for that home.
Yeah, no, that's true. And so they're stuck in their rental properties.
Yeah. And, home ownership, very near and dear to me as it is to you. A couple moments ago, you mentioned that, you were talking about some of the government's involvement, and you stated that, some of it being preserved for white families. Let's expand on that. Great government programs. They went at it, started building some homes, but why that comment? Did you make it?
Well, home ownership, as I mentioned, has been the main source of wealth creation for the white middle class in this country. It also makes it a lot easier for one generation to help the next generation become homeowners. Mm-hmm. So it has a compounding effect. So even though these things happened 3 generations ago, they're still with us today. And if anything, the gaps have just gotten bigger, because if we enabled one group of people to start building this wealth, and as you know, wealth begets more wealth, and wealth compounds, and another whole group of folks were not really given that opportunity, then the gap that created has just continued to grow and grow. So the racial homeownership gap has stayed about the same size since the Fair Housing Act was passed. Even when it was illegal, we have the same homeownership gap today that we had when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race when doing real estate transactions. And we really haven't been able to close that gap. And that's partly because, again, the successive ability of the prior generations to help the next generation become homeowners.
So in some of that, those government initiatives or programs that they were rolling out in the past, they were exclusively like written in there, white families only.
There were restrictive covenants that said that for sure. You can probably, in most places where you live, you can find old deeds where you will see that written. There were also rules that the federal government said about the communities where it was willing to make lending available through the FHA program, for example. And they didn't want to have lenders lending in communities that had mixed race or that were not predominantly white neighborhoods. So and those are just a few of the examples. I recommend everybody read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, to really hear the story of how the federal government policies, as well as state and local policies, zoning included, all contributed to creating this very clear discrimination in who was able to buy homes and create that wealth and build that middle class.
Do you see any of that today, or has it just manifested in a different form that I may not be aware of?
So obviously it is no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. And yet, as I said, we continue to have the same gaps. So it's what people would refer to as sort of systemic things, rules that kind of get baked into our system that continue to make it hard, but that are not explicitly discriminatory. So, we talked about zoning as one example, right? That it's sort of creating communities where you have to have a certain size acreage and you can only build single family homes kind of only makes it possible for people of a certain economic status to be able to move into that neighborhood. And that has a disparate impact on who can, again, because we have this legacy of lack of opportunity to build wealth and access to opportunity. So that's just one example, but rules that determine who gets a mortgage and how much money they can borrow are all sort of correlated with other things that have that carry with them discrimination and a history and legacy of discrimination to them.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You hear it talked about a lot, and but to really kind of understand the root problems of hey, discrimination is illegal. There's laws that protect people. That I mean, sue people over it. That's so you imagine that it's just non-existent today. But what you're saying is highest and best use for land that's being rezoned may not be the most equitable way to zone that, because it has impacts of who can afford it, who can't afford it. Am I
I think that's right. But I would say the zoning oftentimes is what prevents the highest and best use of the land. The highest and best use of the land might be multifamily housing or workforce. It might be the highest and best use for that particular city or community to have that. But the zoning still keeps it stuck as a single family only.
And why do you see communities do that? Right. So, is it a developer that's pushing it? Is it the city council or county council that kind of gets together and say, hey, we think that our community should have more single family? Or, how does it usually, manifest like that? Where does it come from?
Well, we all live in communities, so you've probably seen it play out in your market. And I'm not here to speak about what motivates people, but I will say I think there's a natural tendency to try to protect the value of your own, and sort of pull the gates closed behind you once you have yours, and to be afraid of change, and to not be thinking as much, to be thinking about how do I think about the community benefits versus my own personal bottom line. And it's hard to see how those two can work together over the long term. So I think people tend to just keep a fairly narrow mindset about their own little acre, if you will.
Yeah, that's it's just really, when I kind of put everybody in personas, right? The stereotypes, the greedy developer, right? Not all developers are greedy, but they're profit driven, right? It's for profit business. How do you incentivize them to provide more affordable housing? How do you incentivize a developer that's out there looking to maximize their bottom line?
I would have a hard time blaming the developer for trying to make a profit.
Mhm.
As we've discussed, it's just hard to build affordable housing and make a profit without some kind of a subsidy like the low income housing tax credit, which is, it's the primary tool for building affordable housing. And most of the affordable housing that gets built today is done using that tax credit. And I wouldn't consider developers who do that to be greedy. They're just trying to make it pencil. They're just trying to make it work.
Is it can more of the impact be made, you know, we'll just say government side, whether it's local, state, federal, is that really where the policy needs to happen to kind of put up the guardrails? Like, hey, the developer's always going to be maximizing their bottom line. It's really up to the government to set the stage and design policy that's going to be equitable.
That's the way it's pretty much always worked in the modern history
Okay.
of this country. Housing is very, very much a byproduct of policy decisions at the city, local, state, and federal level, whether that's land use policies, transportation policies are a huge part of our housing policy. Kind of there's taxation is a big part of our housing policy. And so is financing. The federal government is effectively in charge of most of the lending that happens in this country today for homeownership, right? FHA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those systems are highly regulated by the federal government, and even depository institutions, who make loans, they're under government regulation, the FDIC and the OCC and the Federal Reserve, for example. So the financing piece is also some part of the policy landscape that affects all these things. And so there's these complicated things working together that are filtering down to individuals in neighborhoods who don't even really get how all these pieces fit together. And that's why part of the reason I think people are myopic about their own particular corner, their own home. They're protecting that. And they don't really understand how all these other pieces, largely policy driven, are affecting their day-to-day lives.
What, we've spent some time talking about, regulation. Is there, I'm stopping short of saying good regulation, because I don't know, I'm just so resistant to saying that. But there's got to be some things that the federal government has done in the last decade that's been good. What has the federal government done that's good for housing in the last decade?
Sure. Well, I think it would be safe to say that, had the federal government not had the capacity to intervene during the pandemic, we would have seen a housing crisis. It's even hard to imagine. We would have seen people unable to make their mortgage payments. We would have seen incredible foreclosure rates that would have, of course, affected even those people who were able to maintain their jobs and maintain their mortgages. Would have seen, like we did during the foreclosure crisis, would have seen great devaluation. We would have seen people lose their rental housing. I mean, it's apocalyptic, really, to think about it. But by moving very quickly to implement forbearance policies for mortgage holders with Fannie, Freddie, and FHA mortgages, and to implement rental moratorium on rent payments at the federal, but also many states also built in their own rules. This really helped stave off a crisis that was temporary in nature. People just needed some breathing room, and then could get back on track. But I don't think we've had, so that's a tremendous win for federal housing policy.
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. I think some of that too, it's almost like they had some muscle memory from the last financial crisis, 06, 07, of, hey, if you don't act fast, this gets really bad really quick, and they kind of stepped up to the plate and were making pretty quick decisions.
That's absolutely the case. There's a complete learning process from the foreclosure crisis and how we learned to prevent foreclosure. Another place where we learned some things was in disaster areas, right? Because just like the pandemic, a disaster can hit And there's a short period of time where people may not be able to make their housing payments. And so there's a set of rules that were implemented in disaster cases that also informed how people reacted to the how financial institutions and federal policy around mortgages and rentals responded to the pandemic. For sure. We keep getting smarter every time.
Yeah, I get it. Yes. Yes, I would agree with that. Well, we got a upcoming election, not going to get into politics. Don't want to, share who my I'm leaning towards. What are some of the things that you're hearing coming out of, each camp when it, are they saying the right things when it comes to housing? Are there kind of keywords we should be honing in on, or what are you hearing?
Yes, there's keyword. The keyword is housing. Mm-hmm. It has been a long time, other than times of extreme crisis, that housing is really talked about in the federal election policy making cycle, to the extent that it's being talked about today. And I think that's because, as we discussed, what used to just be happening in certain high cost markets is now filtered all around the country. Elected officials are hearing from their constituencies everywhere that housing is the biggest problem to solve, that it's cutting into their ability to pay for education, to pay for food, to live the quality of life that they want to live. They're probably hearing from employers that they can't find people to work at the rates they need, because the housing's so expensive. We have an inflation situation we're trying to get under control, and housing contributes to that because it's the biggest expense of most households. So I just think making sure that housing stays on top of the national agenda, that whichever party is speaking, whichever party is getting elected, that they continue to carry through on the words they're using about housing, and they continue to keep that a focus. But I think that's the main thing. We just want them to keep talking about it and solving.
Yeah, amen to that. It's I'd love to see that be the first thing that I look at in my news feeds when I wake up in the morning. Well,
podcasts like this also really help with that. Well, and I appreciate what you're doing to elevate the issues.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about the future of the housing market or the Urban Institute's role in shaping that?
Well, I'll come back to say that one of the areas that we do spend a lot of time and pay a lot of attention to is the financing side of it. The policies, again, as I mentioned, the government really does have a lot of say in who gets financing, either to build and develop homes, but also especially to buy homes. And that it's we have the power to set the rules that can make a difference here. That's what I kind of want to leave people.
We have the power to set the rules to make a difference. I like that.
Yeah.
Really like that. Well, we usually reserve the end of the podcast for our lightning round, but I feel like I've kind of, some of those questions have just come out. You recommended a book, which is one of my go-to questions. I got to ask you if you could snap your fingers and make one change. That was great. Would you ever, or have you ever built your own home?
Have I ever built my own home? I have not built my own home. I have done a renovation. That was enough for me. I think that there's some really interesting new technologies around home building. Like, I'm picturing the hammer and a nail, right? Habitat, of course, building habitat homes. But I think that there's a whole new set of technologies coming online that are really, hopefully, part of this longer term solution as well. More energy efficient, cheaper to build, new materials, greener, cheaper, faster. So I'm excited about that. So I don't know that when you even pose the question about building a home, what does that really look like in the future?
It's a good question.
Are we going to get a 3D printer to come onto the lot?
I love watching those 3D printed videos. It's like they're almost addicting to watch. Man, that home is getting actually printed. That's pretty.
That's another area where regulation and building codes are in the way of innovation. So we definitely, again, another area where the federal government does establish sets of building codes, and also state and local building codes play a big role. So to the extent that those are getting in the way of innovation and efficiency, we want to be looking at those. But I mentioned renovation, so I'll just say, we think about building new homes, and we need new homes to close this gap. But most homes that sell in this country these days are existing properties, and a really big share of rental properties are what we call naturally occurring affordable housing in communities, mom and pop landlords. And I think we sometimes overlook the sort of existing housing that we have as a source of the solution as well.
That's good. There's a lot of office space coming up, so
Yes,
you
that's
never
right.
know, right?
Converting office space, also just sort of being sure not to lose the stock that we have through obsolescence, right? To keep investing in the existing housing stock.
Free government loans for landlords that convert to housing. There we go. That's
commercial.
Now is I had one more question in there. You mentioned technology. Any particular technology in there that you think is really beneficial, to solving the housing crisis? You got a favorite?
Well, I think, we sort of talked about some of the more, for lack of a better word, sort of factory built solutions, perhaps, that might enable us to more quickly get out of modular, that kind of thing, that might enable us to get out of the hole that we're in faster and more affordably. Obviously, green technologies will be helpful, just because housing contributes so much to the carbon footprint. There's also interesting technologies in the space of underwriting loans and managing risks, right? Artificial intelligence and loan decisioning is a whole new frontier as well.
Exciting stuff. Really exciting.
I can't wait to see. Can't wait to see. But we just got to keep our eye on the ball.
Yeah, no, really exciting stuff. Well, it's been just an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed the time that we spent today. Now, if people wanted to learn more about the Urban Institute or get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can look me up on www.urban.org, and they can find all the centers and all the authors there. And I would love to hear from anybody who is interested in learning more.
That's fantastic. And we'll also include your contact information here at the bottom of the podcast for anybody that wants to reach out. But thank you again, Janneke. It was truly a pleasure being on the podcast today.
All right. Well, thank you for helping elevate the debate.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.